Rick Santorum, what impact had we expected him to have on California's primary, and what do we expect now?
Well, we had hoped that he was going to keep it at least mildly interesting. California is very late in the primary season, June 5th, and I think a lot of people had gone into this season thinking that it was all going to be said and done by the time things rolled around here. And then Rick Santorum surged and suddenly was winning states and picking up delegates, and we thought, oh my gosh, there's actually a race here, and in fact, nobody's going to clinch this before June 5th. We will have something to say. And now Rick Santorum has dropped out. Newt Gingrich and Ron Paul are lagging far behind in the delegate count. Mitt Romney is far and away clearly going to reach the 1,144 delegates he needs to clinch the nomination before anybody else possibly can. Now, the effect of this is that, like I said, it gets a lot less interesting now for at least for Republican voters who are hoping to have some say in picking their presidential nominee. So if Republican voters don't come out in as great numbers, you have to wonder what that does to our down-ticket races, our House races, Senate race, our state legislative races. And this is also the first year in which almost all of those races are subject to our new top two primary system, which means there is no partisan primary. People will go to the polls, they will see all the candidates of all parties for a particular office, and they can choose any of them, no matter how they're registered to vote.
And a lot of those House races are also up for grabs because of redistricting.
A lot of those House races are much more competitive, actually, because of redistricting, not just up for grabs. We account for about a quarter of the nation's in-play House races, according to those in the know. And we have about a dozen House races here in California that are pretty heavily contested by both the Democratic and Republican parties this year.
Let's play the hypothetical. If Rick Santorum had still been in the race at this point, talk about who poll watchers and analysts expected he might appeal to. I mean, he did a campaign event out in Fairfield at the headquarters of Jelly Belly Jelly Beans, and he drew a pretty decent crowd. What would we have expected Rick Santorum to do in California in June if he was still around?
Right. Well, I mean, by going to Jelly Belly, he was clearly appealing to the Reagan legacy, you know, and said as much while he was there. But I think one of the people who co-hosted his event later that night in Alamo, a fundraiser he did, really put it best. She said that, I felt that for the first time in a long time, here's a presidential candidate the conservatives can get behind who loves God first and country second. He was appealing to a very conservative wing of the party that is very religiously oriented. And he made no bones about that, obviously. I think a lot of the people who had supported him are just not all that excited about Mitt Romney. Certainly the ones I talked to this week. They all say they will vote for Mitt Romney. They will support him. But what they basically said is that we will support him because he's not Barack Obama.
But it turns out, California has a lot of very, very deeply conservative Republicans. Does the exit of Santorum make them less likely to be active this fall, which is a harbinger of what might happen down ticket as well?
Yeah, I think it's going to be harder to get those people out on the streets and to the phone banks and walking precincts in a lot of those House races and legislative races. What I don't think is that it's going to significantly depress turnout in the November general election, because ultimately, like I said, if there's anybody that people on the conservative side trust less than Mitt Romney, it's Barack Obama. And as one guy said to me, most people these days come out to vote against somebody rather than for somebody. So I think California's turnout in November will be just fine, but I do think you're going to see a little bit of a lag in June. And that'll determine who gets to November. So
this whole turn of events seems to take some of the luster out of an already lackluster primary. I mean, California is obviously a huge state, but not really a huge political player because it's so far down in the primary calendar. And even if Santorum had been in, you know, it's all but locked up at this point.
It's all but locked up at this point. We will still be the ATM of the nation for political candidates, as we have historically been. Even if the state itself is not in play for the presidential race, which a lot of people don't believe it really will be, the presidential candidates will be here early and often, raising money. The House races are going to bring a lot of excitement and, frankly, a lot of money into the state, which is sort of a reversal of good fortune for us. And ultimately, you know, I think Santorum's move was well advised. There was no way he was going to catch up. He would have had to win more than 3/4 of all the remaining delegates in order to hit the threshold. And by getting out before his home state of Pennsylvania voted, he preserved his viability for future elections.
Gotcha.
So.
Well, there was plenty still on the ballot for June, propositions to vote on plenty of House races.
Yes.
So
yeah.
anyone who's thinking about staying home on Election Day in June should absolutely not. Thank you, Josh. Julie Small of KPCC, let's talk about the UC Davis pepper spray report. The thesis of the report was basically that the pepper spray incident, which has been around YouTube, has been around the web through YouTube more times than I can count, should have and could have been prevented. How?
By having much more powerful leadership at the university level. The report faults the Chancellor Linda Katehi for not taking control of the situation and making clear to the police, the campus police, what she wanted. What she said afterwards in an interview, she wanted a limited operation. They wanted the police to. There was an encampment that went up on the quad, and they decided they wanted those tents taken out. And but she imagined that the police would go in and say, "Take down your tents," and leave it at that. She didn't want any use of force. Well, that did not get communicated. When you read the report, it's very clear everybody had a different understanding of what was agreed to. And then it got worse, I think, on the police side, because you had a chief of police saying to the officers, "Don't wear riot gear, leave those batons behind, don't have pepper spray, you know, keep it, don't antagonize." And they said, you know, we feel threatened, we need to have some protection, we're going to do this. So she didn't take charge and say, "No, you're not going to do it." And so they just run amok.
Let's talk specifically about the pepper spray itself. You had an amazing soundbite, which we ran on KQED, with a student who is also a Marine Corps veteran, who said that he had been through IED attacks and mortars exploding, and he'd been shot at, and that the pepper spray was the most excruciating pain he could ever recall in context of all of his military service. Talk about just the weapon itself and the impact of that on those protesters.
Well, one of the things in the report that was, I think, that really affected me was that this weapon was not authorized for the police to use on campus. They were just not supposed to use it, and it was a very a weapons grade or much a stronger, potent kind of pepper spray that was supposed to be sprayed at a further distance. So you've got this guy spraying it right into people's faces, about 3 feet from them. I think the students are most upset about that, and upset about the whole idea that pepper spray is just something that's being used a lot on campuses and might be being used too quickly.
I've been hearing it compared a lot to somebody just kind of watering his flowers in the garden with that kind of casualness. Who was on the task force committee, by the way?
It was a collection of people that were nominated from different parts, different departments of the university, and it was led by the retired California Supreme Court Justice Cruz Reynoso.
You were on the campus recently. What was the mood there about all of this?
Well, it was interesting because I went in early for the day of the release of the report, thinking that there would be groups of students eagerly waiting to read it, and they were not. People, because it got delayed, a month. People had sort of moved on a little bit or weren't paying a lot of attention. But when they had a foreman to discuss it, where they took questions, more students showed up there. But the people who were still really following it are the people who were arrested. They say they're being prosecuted by the university officials, and they're still very upset about it, and they want the campus police to leave, and they feel the report doesn't do enough.
Is there any indication that heads may roll as a result of this?
This report was not about disciplinary action. It was about identifying what happened, what went wrong, and what could be improved. But one of the things that it does suggest, too, is that the UC system itself needs to have a system-wide policy, because the way it is now, each university has a lot of control over how they manage their police force. And they're saying, maybe we need to step up and do more.
It seems interesting to me, at least, in the context of the history of the University of California, considering that UC campuses have dealt with student protests forever. I mean, from the massive protests of the 60s to the ones today, one would think that by now the system has thought this all the way through. What concrete steps are happening now to determine exactly what UC is going to do, or at least a matrix of guidelines, as it were, in situations like this?
Well, at UC Davis, what they're talking about is, having a very set structure and how a decision gets made. Thinking ahead that actually there is going to be civil disobedience on their campuses, assuming it's going to happen. And how do you plan for that? And who makes the decisions? And what are the options? What do we consider to be violent action by a student? What happens if a student violates the rules that have been set out in that campus? What's the response? All that stuff was not determined in advance, and so it became very confused. The leadership was very diffused.
I would think that one of the concerns on the part of the police would be if we put all our cards on the table, how we are going to react to this, how we're going to do this, what our policies are. Some smart group of students might say, well, here's how we get around all of that. Is there enough consideration being given to the fact that if you put too many cards on the table, you lose the game?
Well, I'm sure that is their perspective, and I think one of the things that's come out of this is that this is a university campus, and the campus police actually work for the university. It's a little different, and they work to protect the safety of students. And so the students' point was, well, how were they doing that when they were pepper spraying people down the throat, and spraying so closely, and when they were kneeling like that, kneeling with arms linked in a peaceful protest?
Any response from the university to the report?
Not an official response, but what they're supposed to do is that the chancellor is supposed to come up with the solutions, and then she's supposed to present her ideas to the UC president, Mark Yudof, and then they'll go from there.
I also understand there are two public meetings next week on Tuesday and Thursday at UC Davis where people can continue to opine on this. Julie Small, thank you.
Thank you.
Tom Vakar, the empire strikes out. That's the way they described it in the Marin Independent Journal when George Lucas lost his bid to build a digital film production complex in the coincidentally named Lucas Valley area. What was the straw that broke the camel's back? This project has been held up for a long time. What ultimately killed it?
Well, it was a straw because a long, long time ago, in a world far away known as Marin County, George Lucas 16 years ago decided he wanted to expand the Skywalker property and in fact set up a new thing on the Grady Ranch, which is between Skywalker and where a lot of the people who don't want this to have legs happen. He started making applications, and in 1996 a plan was adopted and many times modified through a lot of negotiations, a lot of downsizing, a lot of this and a lot of that. And for 16 years this thing has been going on and becoming more and more contentious the closer it gets to reality, and it was getting very, very close to reality. And the neighbors, a thing called the Lucas Valley Estates Homeowners Association, had filed some complaints, and some other people had filed some complaints with various agencies. And George Lucas, thinking that he'd like to live to actually see this thing happen, said, we're just not going to do it here. And the decision is final. That has been reiterated by the Lucas people for a long, long time. The net effect of this is really twofold. It is a horrific black eye to Marin County in terms of being a place that welcomes business. It's got a, it's now got a worldwide reputation of, a guy with a clean industry that employs people at a fairly high wage and all of that stuff. Basically couldn't do what he wanted to do in Marin County. That doesn't help them with other businesses around the world. And the other thing is it raises, I think, perhaps as much as it has ever been raised, the regulatory process itself. Because the reality of this situation was there were umpteen local, regional, state, county, federal agencies, all that had a little part of this. And every time one of those issues was taken care of, then somebody else would raise another issue. And it just got to the point where he said, there's really no rational reason to believe we can ever get this done, so we're not going to do it.
Now, the county supervisors have called on supporters of this project to show up at this Tuesday supervisors meeting, 10 a.m., and basically implore George Lucas to reconsider. He has said that there are film timetables that have to move. We've got work that's got to be done, so it's already too late. If it's too late for this project, and the regulatory structure seems so Byzantine and huge that reforming it might take, that will be a long, long time from now, what to do?
Well, I think one of the things going to happen is there are going to be some heads roll in Marin County, and there are going to be some real hard looks taken at the process itself. There's nothing wrong with having environmental impact. There's nothing wrong with wanting to make sure that things are done. There's nothing wrong with wanting to make sure that the neighbors who are there are not beset upon by people that could care less about their situation. And admittedly, this is a two-lane rural road that we're talking about. But the reality of the situation is, how does it take 16 years? I mean, you could get a nuclear power plant up quicker than you could get this thing done. And it's just a Byzantine situation, which I think is going to now really get a lot of people involved in the issue of what do we do about this? Why do we have to have so many agencies having so many different cards that they can put on the table and stop the whole process? And I think it's a fair question now.
So if the force wasn't with him at this site, where might Lucas go now to build this thing?
Well, I was talking to some people about that, and obviously the most logical place would be in the Presidio, which has to make it on its own within a few years or revert back to federal control. So Lucas went down there and built a magnificent facility that blends perfectly into that. So it's possible that he might get some real interest on the part of the government there. Emeryville is an interesting place because it's Pixar and there's Expressions College there, exactly the kind of people that Lucas would like. So Emeryville is a real possibility. You're somewhere in the East Bay. And then finally Silicon Valley, I mean, custom made for the kinds of people that he would want. So there are three very likely places right here in the Bay Area. But having said that, there are plenty of other places that will do backflips to get this. So he finds himself in the very enviable seat of being able to pick and choose where he wants to go, and he has the money to make it happen, and that is the most important thing. This would have been very good for Marin County. It would have been hundreds of millions of dollars invested, would have created all kinds of taxes and all of this stuff. Marin County's got a real problem, and everybody's pointing fingers. That was the other thing that was so interesting. The Homeowners Association said, we just wanted this, and we don't think this is a good idea, and the supervisors pointing, and the agencies are pointing, and all that stuff. And every one of them, to a person that I talked to, said, there can be no better neighbor than George Lucas.
And now their neighbor might end up being affordable housing, or at least that's what George Lucas would like.
That's exactly right, and that might have been a little bit of vitriol on his part, but it is zoned for residential housing. And tell you something, if you have a lot of hundreds of people living out there, that is going to increase the traffic on that road, which is a windy, narrow, 2-lane road.
Gotcha. And I think it's also worth mentioning as we move on that there have been a number of residents there who say that they have been threatened by other people. One who said that he had gotten a death threat, and he's not even part of the group that opposed this. I also just want to make it clear to our Marin County residents, we do not all consider it a galaxy far, far away, just for the record. Very nice place to be. Tom Vakar of KTVU, Julie Small of KPCC, and Josh Richman of the Bay Area News Group. Thank you all.